Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Indie Game Movement, the podcast that talks about the marketing and business of indie games. I'm Andrew Pappas, and I'm going to be your host today, and we're going to be talking about that hidden risk in reaching global players. You know, reaching global players takes more than strong localization. The meaning of a game can shift across markets based on cultural context, symbolism, visual cues, and even geopolitical sensitivity. So today, we're going to unpack the risks indie developers often miss and explore how to think more strategically about global player perception without compromising your creative vision. So that's what we're going to be talking about right here today on Indie Game Movement. Hey everyone, and we're back. And today with us, I have Kate Edwards. Kate, how's it going? And thank you so much for being here today.
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Yes, I'm excited. It's nice to have you. As I shared with you before, you're someone I've wanted to get on the show for a while. I don't know why it hasn't happened, but you know what? It's happening now. So I'm grateful that you're here. And folks, for those of you who aren't familiar with Kate, they are the Chief Experience Officer and co-founder of Set Cheddars. And Kate, if you don't mind, please, take a moment and share with us what exactly is Set Cheddars, and if you could give us brief background and history of the work you've done in the industry as well.
Yeah, so Set Jitters is actually a side project of mine. That's kind of my hobby that became a passion project. So back during COVID, I was stuck at home for 18 months, like many people. And because I normally travel about 75% of the year to speak at different events, mostly game industry events, one of the hobbies I've been doing since I was a teenager growing up in Southern California is visiting filming locations. Because I just think it's fun to go where they film Star Wars or Indiana Jones or whatever floats your boat. And so I got hooked on that a long time ago because obviously in Southern California, there's filming locations all around you. And so fast forward to COVID and I was stuck at home. And so myself and 4 other people got together and said, hey, why don't we make an app that helps people find filming locations and facilitates that? And so Set Jetters was born. And so now this just hobby of mine has become a passion project and a startup and a business. But that's kind of my side gig. The main work I've been doing for 33 years now in games is I'm a geographer, and I've been doing what I call culturalization work on games. So I basically started at Microsoft. I was there for 13 years. I went into Microsoft as a cartographer to make maps on a product that was called Encarta Encyclopedia, which some people might remember Encarta if you're of a certain age or older.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was basically the last major encyclopedia before Wikipedia showed up online. So I made the maps for Encarta, and then eventually my role there at Microsoft evolved into where the company was pushing into a lot of mapping products, and they needed someone to help them navigate the geopolitical complications, like how do you show Taiwan, how do you show Kashmir, and other areas of the world. And I could do that. So they said, hey, we're going to hire you into a full-time role. Here's a piece of paper, write your title and job description, and we'll hire you. So I called myself a geopolitical strategist, and that was my title at Microsoft initially. And so I basically was there and started working on games in 1993. Flight Sim 5.0 was the first game I ever worked on because the team came to me for some cartographic advice. But then, over the years, I started getting questions from all over the place and all over the company, as well as the early game teams, which were all PC back in the day, pre-Xbox. And then Microsoft made a big faux pas in South Korea that got the company in big trouble. And it happened in Encarta World Atlas. And we fixed it and everything was fine. And then 3 months later, Age of Empires came out, the very first one. And it repeated a mistake that we had fixed. And the Korean government got now really upset at us because they said, hey, you fixed this. And we're like, well, we fixed it in Encarta and we didn't fix it in Age of Empires. And what it exposed is that at a company that large is that when you've got these massive silos where people are working so far apart, both figuratively and literally, it's a huge risk exposure. And so I gave me the idea to create a new kind of team. And so I wrote a proposal took about 7 months to pitch to 5 different VPs before I got it approved. And so my geopolitical strategy team was born on April 7th, 1998. I'll never forget. And so now for the next 7 years, I'm running an effort where I'm helping the entire company navigate cultural and geopolitical risks in the content of their products, which included all the games. So that's how I really started doubling down and working on games in a more formal capacity. So working on all the Age of Empires and Fable and Halo and all of that stuff back in the day. And that's where I found my true love. I mean, that's what I love to do, is doing the culturalization work, but on video games is like the most happiest place I could ever invent for myself. So then I left in 2005, created my own company, Geography, to do culturalization consulting with the intention of working mainly on games. And I have pretty much done that for the last 21 years. I just celebrated my 21st anniversary self-employment on April 1st.
April's a big month for you.
Yeah. And so at this point, I've worked on 318 games over my career between the Microsoft and Geography stuff. And at any given time, I'm working on maybe 10 to 15 games because I have clients like EA and Microsoft and Sony and others. And so for any one of those, like EA, I'm working across all their franchises at the same time, Battlefield, Sims, everything. And that's basically what I've been doing. And then because I have worked alongside developers for so long, and I just love these people. These are my people, and I want life to be better for them in this industry, which is why I started doing a lot of advocacy work as well. I got very active in the International Game Developers Association. I created the Localization Special Interest Group. I revived the Seattle chapter. And then they asked me to run the global organization, which I ended up doing for 5 years, from 2012 to 2017. And then went back to my consulting work. And then the Global Game Jam, the world's largest game creation event, they had asked me to be their executive director. So I did that for 3 years. And I'm just now coming off the board of directors after my term there. So yeah, it's been, so I like to keep active in trying to make this a better industry, but at the same time, my daily work is essentially making sure that games are not going to get themselves in trouble in different countries around the world. And that's about as short as I can make it.
And it's extremely important and everything too on that front. Wow. Really appreciate you sharing all that with us, because I think it's just good to know, not just like, good. And plus, I think timing wise, this is like, I think this episode should be going on the on that anniversary that you called out to.
Yeah.
April 7th. So that's amazing. So so many amazing things, folks. I'm not get you know me. If I let myself, I'll digress a minute. So let's just keep going on. Kate, thank you so much. But you know what? As much as we got to learn about you in that moment, I would love for us to get to know you a little bit. And how we're going to do that, folks, as you probably know, is have Kate go through the Q box rounds with some random quick questions we've got prepared for her today. Kate, are you ready for the Q box round?
I'm ready.
Oh yeah, she's born ready. All right, what's the most common mistake devs or studios make with their game?
I would say that the biggest mistake is some level of cultural appropriation when they're creating characters or creating environments or architecture in the world that they build. We build worlds from a combination of real world inspiration, because that's where a lot of art begins, but it also is a combination of our own imagination. And that's the beauty of it. It's a mixture of those two, because there's always some kind of real world cue that kind of gives us that idea. If you look across all fantasy and science fiction and other forms of fiction that takes place in a non-real world environment, there's something there that inevitably was triggered by a certain culture or a certain cue in the real world. And so what a lot of teams do is they'll say, hey, that's cool. We'd love to have that as being part of this group in our game or that group, which is totally fine. But oftentimes what they do is just kind of lift that visual element or lift that idea out of that group in the real world and put it into their game. And they don't do what I call creating enough allegorical distance, because when they're lifting that idea from that culture, it's effectively saying the culture in our game is going to be an allegory of those people in the real world. That's fine. All creative art form does it. Film, TV, games, we all do it. Allegory is a very powerful mechanism. But what they don't do is do enough creative work to make sure there's enough distance between the original real world inspiration and the in-game implementation. So we want to make sure we do a little extra creative work to make sure that people are not going to immediately identify that element that you took out of the real world and used in your game. And it basically just means doing a little extra homework, a little extra research to make sure you're not essentially borrowing something that you shouldn't borrow.
Yeah, no, that's so many important things there, and I'm sure we're gonna dive into it more too. But like, it's funny, maybe relate a little bit. One thing that came to mind as you were saying that too, I know like, like especially in film, you could use this in two of one ways. It could be come off as negative or intended, which is like taking chopsticks and just shoving them straight into
Yeah.
a bowl of rice, right? It's
Yeah,
sticking up.
exactly.
At any rate, lots of great points there. So awesome. Next is, what was your childhood favorite game?
Oh, that's so hard. Well, I mean, to be clear, my early childhood, there was no such thing as video games. So board games, Monopoly, all that kind of stuff. I think my favorite board game was Risk. It's
Oh,
probably
I
why
love
I
that one
became
too. Yeah.
it's probably why I became a geopolitical strategist, to be quite honest. Just like I know for a fact that Tolkien's map of Middle Earth is what inspired me to become a cartographer. But Risk is a big one. I think I would say video games. I mean, in high school, I was in high school in the early 80s during the golden age of the arcades. So for me, the Atari Star Wars, the stand-up console with the funky controller, was by far my most favorite game. In fact, I've got a version of it right over here in my office. And I loved that game. But then I would say, as far as like more modern video games, it's hard to say. I mean, there's so many that I spent a lot of time with, like Wizardry back in the day. And then, but I would have to say, if I had to pick one, it would be Halo, because not only did I work on the original trilogy, but even to this day, if I have some time to kill, I will relax by playing Halo multiplayer, because I love the universe, I love the lore, I love the gameplay. So yeah, probably Halo. That's got to be my number one.
Absolute love it. All right. And last but not least, and the staple here on the show is, what game are you playing now?
I play daily games, like play Pokemon Go every day, trade my gifts with my friends from around the world, all that kind of stuff. I do Bejeweled Blitz. I'm probably one of the last few people who are playing Bejeweled Blitz. At least it feels like it. I did have a massive Balatro addiction, which I kind of cured to a certain degree because I took a 3-week trip to New Zealand. I had to speak there in December, and I just didn't have time to play it as much. So thankfully, it kind of helped me to play it more reasonably now, which is once in a while, not like constantly. I don't get a lot of time to play like big, massive console games, or a lot of indie games too. I mean, a lot of the indie games I get exposed to is because I get asked to like act as a judge for like an event's indie contest or something. So I often say yes to that because I want to be exposed to a lot of the great indie games, and that's how I discover them, is by being a judge. Because honestly, I am so busy actually working on games that I just do not have time to sit down. The last major game I played, the Indiana Jones game, Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, that I worked on, that was the holidays of 2024. That's when I sat down and actually played like a big game like that end to end. But yeah, it's few and far between.
Yeah, I love that. It's like, in a way, you're almost like indirectly forcing yourself to these other things, but you're doing so in a way that's helping out these spaces too. I love it.
Yeah, I try. I mean, it's just like this past Thanksgiving, I normally would have gone over to some friend's house, but they were traveling, and I wasn't. So I basically was at home alone. And that's when I decided to just sit down and play Clair Obscur Expedition 33, because I'd heard so many great things about it.
Yep.
And I played it for about 9 or 10 hours. And I got a really good feel for the game. I'm glad I did that. I will not have time to go back and play the rest. But at least I get a good sense of the game. So at least I can do that once in a while.
Yep. I love it. To this day, I have a Switch on my desk. All I do is hit a toggle switch and I'm ready to play, and that's even
Nice.
hard. So can
I like
definitely
that.
relate. Well, Kate, really appreciate that. But now, folks, let's get into the conversation. And what I shared with you in the intro is we're going to be talking about that hidden risk in reaching global players. And honestly, who better of a person to have this conversation with than Kate? So to kick things off, Kate, I'm curious, when indie developers think about reaching global players, which I'm sure many are, they often focus on, localization first, right? But with that, what hidden risks do they miss when they just stop at localization?
Well, I think that's one thing that's really important to understand. I mean, localization, obviously, and when we say localization, to be clear, I know I'm language translation, so translating the text-based content in the game, and obviously that's important. I mean, you want legibility among different countries of the world and different regions. I often encourage indie developers, like if you can't afford to do localization, you can probably find somebody who is competent enough, a native like Spanish speaker to do some translation for you. Because honestly, unless your game is something like a huge RPG with thousands or millions of words, it probably won't be too difficult to do some translation. But like if they're based in the US, I often tell people at least do Spanish. That opens up almost the entire Western Hemisphere, except Brazil, and plus in the US alone, you've got at least a third of the population speak Spanish. So that instantly opens up your game to a whole wide group of people. But language translation is only one part of it, and it can be expensive. The other aspects that I cover is not localization, but I cover, when I say culturalization, I'm looking at everything else in the game that could be potentially triggering to people. It could be a character design. It could be, like we mentioned earlier, some of the cultural elements that are pulled out of the real world and used in the game. It could be even something as simple like when I've worked on dancing games, I'm looking for gestures and body language because those are interpreted different ways in the world. Just like, the rock on symbol that people use, you'll see a lot in dancing games. Like I worked on the Dance Central series. So people are using rock on, which is fine, but contextualize it. In Texas, it means hook 'em horns if you're a University of Texas fan. And in Italy, it means I'm sleeping with your wife. You have to be very careful, just like, the good old thumbs up gesture is the same as the middle finger. In the UK, they do this. They don't do the middle finger. They've got this called the fig. There's this symbol as well, which is also offensive. There's also the matzah from Greece, like this, and on it goes. So there's nuance to these elements that we put into our games. Even something like a map. I mean, a map, if it shows political boundaries, and let's say, for example, your game just has a map that appears just for like 5 seconds at the beginning of the game to kind of set the location if the game's based in the real world. If that map has political boundaries that are disagreeable with like India or China, they will instantly ban your game. And even other things like in Argentina, they still call the Falkland Islands Islas Malvinas because they still have a claim over those islands, even though they lost a war to the UK over 44 years ago. So there's that kind of level of stuff. There's so many little issues like that. And that's what I focus on, are basically mostly the non-linguistic assets in the game. It could be symbology, it could be gestures, it could be character design, the clothing, it could be the environments, it could be the architecture. A lot of times we're dealing with the narrative itself. It's like, what is the story about? Like in some cases, I've worked on games which are like fantasy or sci-fi games where they took a real world part of history and then they fictionalized it, like the attack on Pearl Harbor. And it kind of goes back again to that issue I talked about of allegorical distance. It's fine to perhaps use Pearl Harbor as a starting point to recreate that, let's say in a fantasy universe, but make sure it's not something that's going to be instantly identifiable by players and say, oh, wait, they're reenacting Pearl Harbor. It's like, do you really want to show that, especially if to Japanese or US players? And maybe not. And you could argue, well, that was a long time ago. Does anyone care? It's like, well, you could have that discussion as well. So there's so many things you have to think about.
There are so many things. And it's funny, that last one you just mentioned too, I'm reading a book not related to really anything we're talking about here, but they were making a point and a reference about I kind of like a sticky factor to things. And it did happen to relate, and it's not relating to what's going on in the world today right now, this book at least, but they did call out to something that happened like in Persia and the Persian Wars like forever ago. And they were saying that there's two to this day, and I think either in these Middle Eastern countries, there are footsteps or whatever that are representative of figures in history that has happened centuries ago. And it's still ingrained in their culture, and that's still a common thing type thing. And that we're talking about centuries where it's like, oh my goodness, like that's amazing that that type of stuff stays around. And in other times it does, but so many interesting things there. You did a really good job at defining, I think, and giving us an idea of what culturalization is. But what I'm curious is, because it sounds like it could be pretty nuanced. To others, it might even be a little overwhelming. What is a good way indie developers can kind of approach and apply this to their games, because I'm sure many of us are thinking, well, we want to be as empathetic as possible.
Well, I think that part of the challenge there, and I know a lot of indie devs. I've worked on a lot of indie games, and my heart goes out to you because I know what a challenge it is. Because a lot of the issues that we're talking about, like culturalization and localization, that's usually the last thing you're thinking about because you
Yep.
just want to get the damn game done. And I know how challenging that can be. So I totally understand when these issues tend to be lower priority, but the reality of the world we live in today is that these issues are no less volatile for an indie developer as they are for a AAA developer. AAA, yeah, they're larger targets, so they tend to get more
Yeah.
of the noise and all of that, but that doesn't mean it shields smaller developers from the same effects because it can affect them as well. But it also kind of dovetails into the creative freedom issue. It's like you have to decide as the creator of this world, where your values are, what are you willing to do and not do? Are you willing to change your creative vision to make it adaptable for a certain country? Or do you want to just, hold the line and say, this is the game I want to make. This is my artistic self-expression. I'm not going to change a thing. That is absolutely valid. That's a completely valid approach. It's just that you have to realize that approach may not make your game compatible with a lot of parts of the world. And if you're fine with that, then I say do it. Go ahead and release. I wouldn't judge anyone for that because it is a good approach. But the more you want your game to be enjoyed by as many people as possible around the world, because we live in a very diverse world with a lot of different worldviews, especially a world that's very polarized right now, which is a whole nother topic, then you have to think about how will somebody in another culture receive the creative vision that I'm putting out there. And so half the battle, and I know this sounds cliche, but honestly, half the battle is just being aware of that culturalization is a reality, and that it's those kind of higher level issues around cultural perception is something we need to think about if that matters to you. If you want to maximize the reach of your content, then it's something that you may want to consider, and really consider it, when you're starting out. Don't wait until the game's almost done. You really have to think about it as part of the initial creative process.
Yeah, that's a great point too, because if you think about it, that's probably one of the best ways we could potentially even avoid risks. And on top of that, being a little bit more proactive with the process too. So if let's say we go into making a game, and we're like, you know what, we want to reach a global audience. Well, it's like, okay, great, but maybe the next question, and then it's a series of questions like, all right, well, how broad do we want to go? Is it China?
Mm-hmm.
Is it Middle East? Is it just Europe? Like, where exactly are we going to do that? And then from there, I would say most people are like North America and Europe. That's probably going to be most of us. But let's say if there's other intentions or reasons to go elsewhere, it's really kind of like defining those things and what's that intent, what's the reason, and whatever they are is probably fine. But it sounds like that's what would be like a really great process, kind of starting and moving forward on that front. And it's I'm gonna go off script a little bit here because I want your input on this, because I always find this particular point when it relates to world markets very interesting. So I understand, for example, Kuwait. I don't know where they are at now in terms of how accessible games are for them. I know there's some restrictions on video games and what the the government allows, for example. And then on top of that, there's a lot of like big networks like I think PlayStation, even Xbox, that don't provide direct access to some of their titles based off like the networks and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
They have to go through like VPNs or other means to create
Right.
accounts and stuff. But what I find interesting, because I remember talking to someone about this, they said sometimes, yeah, it would be great to have content like culturally referenced or localized and stuff, but they also grew up with games like Street Fighter and all these other things, so they prefer like just these like Western game experiences. So is that something to account for too, as well?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain level of nostalgia, I would say, for some of the older games. I mean, that's why you're seeing the persistence of some IP that is just never going to go away. Street Fighter, Mario, I mean, you name it. There's IPs that have been around for decades that people just love, and it kind of for all kinds of reasons. And some people like it for its sort of 80s or 90s decadence, so to speak. The low res art style and all that kind of stuff, because it kind of harkens back to a different era. I mean, for me, it's very nostalgic because that is the era I came from. But part of it is that when, to your point about targeting, for example, North America and Europe as a market, that's something that I hear most typically, especially from a lot of indie devs I visit around the world. I'm like, where do you want your game to go? Well, North America and Europe, because that's where all the money is. It's like, well, there's truth to that, but at the same time, that is absolutely not where the growth is, because at least for the last decade, the fastest growing region for games is the EMEA region. I should say the MEA region, Middle East and Africa, by far. Especially the MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, has been growing almost 10% year over year in terms of gameplay.
Yeah,
and Latin America has been like 6 or 7% year over year. Asia Pacific still has remained fairly strong with around 5% year over year, whereas Europe and North America are down by like around 2% year over year. So that's something to take into consideration, is who do you want playing your game, who's more likely to play your game. And the thing is that we can target different areas of the world and say, okay, I only want to release my game in this place or that place. That's fine, but you got to remember, in today's world, when we release any content, it's everywhere. There is no such thing as like actually targeting. It used to be the case back in the 90s when, like, working at Microsoft, we could actually make a CD-ROM or DVD and ship it physically to that place.
Right.
And we would have plausible deniability if it went somewhere else and it got banned because of something we did. We said, well, hey, we didn't intend it to go there. It was not, it was, we shipped it physically to that place. But in today's world, especially when most everything is digitally released, it's everywhere. There's going to be, there will be screenshots everywhere. It's already going to be recorded on Reddit. It's already going to be up on TikTok or whatever, especially if there's a faux pas or something offensive. And there's no taking it back. There's no do-over. And so we do have to be more mindful today that even if you say, I'm making this game mainly for this audience, that's great. And I think that's a valid strategy. But at the same time, just remember, that's not the only audience that's going to see your game. So if there's something in there that could be potentially problematic, there's no guarantee that someone else may not see it.
Yeah. And, I think a good way to look at this, too, is you mentioned how, okay, with AAA, yeah, they're obviously a bigger target. They're easier to find and get in touch with for the most part when you're looking at the really high-level, big-time stuff. And for any of it might be like, well, that's not that big of a deal. But I think what you're saying here is the reality, too, is, okay, maybe a legal team isn't, I'm not going to be sent something or like that, right? Maybe.
Yeah.
But it could be, that rubbed me the wrong way. And now, because especially if it was maybe something very offensive that wasn't intended to be that, now that's starting word of mouth and everything. Yep. And it could be in spaces that you don't normally monitor or check. And then it's like, why aren't my sales as good as I thought they were based off of whatever the reasons are? And let's face it, this day and age or any time, we have such a hard time getting down to the root cause of things because everything's nuanced. There's so many things going on. We will see lots of symptoms and then come up with our own idea of what those root causes are, I think, a lot of the time. Whereas it could have been something else that either was not only avoidable, but you're looking at all the wrong directions to address what that pain point or symptom is.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true. And I mean, that the thing that we have to realize, and I especially give this message to indie devs, is that whether you like it or not, somebody will hate your game because that's the world we live in today. And you have to accept that fact. In fact, I was giving a lecture last year at different events called, Making Games in a Polarized World. And one of the parts of that lecture, I have a slide where I have the whole audience repeat after me. Someone will hate my game. Someone will hate my team. Somebody will hate me. Because that, unfortunately, is the world we live in, especially with the polarization that we've seen culturally and politically. So what you have to do is get over the fact that somebody's going to potentially hate your game. In fact, even if your game's not already out there released, they're probably already hating it anyway, for whatever reason. So don't worry about people hating the game. What you're solving for in the work that I try and help developers do, is it going to be 30 people or 30,000 people? Because if it's 30 people, it's another Friday afternoon. If it's 30,000, then you may have done something that triggered a particular culture or particular region, or you did something that is not working in a way that you intended. So that's really what we try and solve for. It's about mitigating the amount of potential for backlash. It's not saying we're going to take all backlash away, because that's impossible.
Yeah.
So that's basically the exercise, is thinking about what elements in our game, in our world building, might trigger a larger group to have that kind of reaction. Because obviously we don't want to have that with our games, because it ultimately distracts people from the whole mission and the intention of our creative vision, which is to immerse them in a narrative and a world that we've created for their enjoyment. And we don't want to put something in there that's going to kick them out of the experience.
Yeah, I have to call out that tip you said, that the exercise I think is so helpful and imperative that people do that. The same book that I'm reading references something like that, but essentially what you're doing with that exercise is you're getting people ready to face what is always going to be a fear. No one
Yes.
wants to hear anything negative or bad, and what this is doing is allowing us to accept the fact that things can and will be chaotic, or it can and will be negative. And instead of and accepting that fact as, hey, that's just part of the journey and part of something I need to navigate from, as opposed to, oh crap, how do I deal with this now emotionally, especially when it's something emotional, like that's your baby you're making and now someone is just hating on it. Like,
Yes.
it's hard to get out of any moment when those things happen. We've all been there, folks, at one point or another. So I love that exercise. And folks, for you listening, like, please try this out, or maybe, Kate will have something or share something later at some point, or just whatever, or just listen back to that little snippet there, because that will help you in so many more ways. And there, I'm not going into it, but there's actually, like, psychological brain things, patterns that are happening because of that too. It's like,
Yeah.
there's science to back it, but that's why I love. Sorry, I just had to say that, Kate, because I think
Thank you.
that's huge. It's really important. We don't do enough of it, and the more we do it, the more likely to be like, okay, they hate it. So what? This is my focus. This is what I'm doing, and moving on.
And just as a footnote to that, I mean, I am speaking from experience, because when I ran the IGDA, I was running it during Gamergate. So I became one of their primary targets because I was a woman in a leadership role in the game industry. So I know exactly what it feels like. I lived with death threats and harassment for over 2 years straight from that group. I was in touch with the FBI on a regular basis. So it's like, I know what it feels like. I've been there. I've got my scars. So yeah, I can absolutely relate. I know what it feels like. So, and you don't want to go there.
Yeah, again, and sorry that you had to go through that, but again, it's so good to know how you approaching these things and learning about these things, that I hopefully in a way we can look at it as a means to making us stronger, and making and hearing these stories and making this better people ourselves.
Yeah.
You shared some really cool stuff, though, and I want to get back into those moments too, where you were talking about all these things, and how, like, okay, we shouldn't wait too long for stuff, and there's a lot of things to consider and everything. Is there any, just to make something a little bit more, I guess, concrete, with like an example or something? Is there any, like, a small detail that you can share that might have, whether it's with the indie game or any game for that matter, that carried a much bigger cultural, geopolitical impact than people might have expected? Because I'm sure we could pull an example from just about anything. They're like, oh, that's nothing.
Yeah. Well, I've got so many examples, but I'll tell you one that was probably one of the most grievous issues I had to deal with. This was a game back in my Microsoft days. It was early Xbox, and it was a game called Kakeru Chojin, Back Alley Brutal. That was the name of the game. It was a hand-to-hand fighting game. And in the game, they had an audio file that was used for one of the characters. So you look at the profile of the character, he's kind of shadow boxing. He was supposed to be from Somalia, and there's this music playing in the background. It's very beautiful music where you hear somebody chanting. And it turns out that this audio file was a piece of audio that was chanting of verses from the Quran, from the Islamic Quran. And we found out very late in the product's development that that's what the audio was. And of course, I said, you got to take this out. And I actually verified that with some of the Middle Eastern subsidiary folks. And I said, hey, how do you feel about this? I already knew how they were going to feel, but I needed to tell me in writing. So I took what their opinions were back to the team and said, you need to fix this. And they said, okay, fine, we'll fix it. We'll take out the audio file. We'll put on just some generic one without lyrics. I'm like, all right, cool. The problem was that we already had about 75,000 units that were packaged with that audio, the problematic audio. And I said, well, you're obviously going to recall those and destroy them, right? And they're like, no, but that's expensive. I'm like, it's not expensive for Microsoft. You guys throw internal parties that cost more than that. But they said, you know what, we'll release it only in the US. And I'm like, as a geographer, I'm just like, you realize how many Muslims are in the United States?
Yeah.
You know, it like you realize that like Detroit, for example, is at least 50% Muslim. And they're like, don't worry about it. And then sure enough, about 3 months later, we got the equivalent of a cease and desist letter from the Saudi Arabian government, but not just this government, but from the religious council of the Saudi Arabian government, which is an entity that used to exist in that time. And so it basically was addressed to Bill Gates, as they all were back in the days when he was still CEO, Dear Mr. Gates, and basically was describing how we've offended Islam. Now we have a problem. This becomes front page news in Riyadh. It becomes front page news in Dubai, and it starts spreading in the region. And it gets to a point where the head of the Microsoft Middle East region calls me up and said, we need you to come here and help us do damage control, because we have no idea what was going on, because we're not on the product side. We're on the front line in the subsidiaries. We're here to promote Microsoft as a brand. And now we're having to defend Microsoft, in the face of this criticism. And what made this even worse is that Microsoft was one of the very first software companies that localized all their stuff into Arabic. So there was a tremendous amount of goodwill in the region towards Microsoft. And Microsoft had a lot of like massive enterprise level contracts with governments and other entities. And now this feels like a family member stabbing you in the back with this level of offense. So you could understand why they were so upset. So I ended up having to go to Riyadh 2 days after the second Gulf War had started, right next door in Iraq. So I went to Riyadh, and I ended up apologizing face to face with the head of the religious council of the Saudi government on behalf of Microsoft. And, that was stressful. There's a lot of detail to the story I'm not going to go into. In fact, I would encourage you, Polygon wrote a great article about this in January of 2025. You could look it up, about this whole episode, and they did a great job on detailing it. So basically, I had to go to Dubai and also do a little dog and pony show like that. Finally got back to headquarters in Redmond. And I'd been telling the games division, Robbie Bach and Shane Kim, who ran the division, they're great guys, but they were just resistant to what I was saying when I said, you got to do this kind of work on all the games, because I'd already gotten the rest of Microsoft on board with this geopolitical strategy approach. But the games were resistant because they said, well, we're allowed to be a bit edgy and cool, but not like this. But about 2 weeks after I got back from that trip and we'd had to go through that whole mess, Robbie called me up and he said, hey, that stuff you've been telling us to do? I think we should do that on all the games. I'm like, great, man. That's why you're the senior VP and get paid all those big bucks to make those big, smart decisions.
Yep. Exactly.
So basically, that's how the games at Microsoft started going through that. But the whole point of that is this one audio file that nobody decided to check. Nobody during the whole production of the game said, hey, what is this? Where is it from? We eventually did find the source, and it comes from a source library of music. But nobody asked the most fundamental question, what are the lyrics in this audio? And that led to this whole big mess. And I mean, that could happen to anybody, not just a big AAA game.
Exactly. And I love that example too, because for those of us who might thinking, oh, well, this is Microsoft, they have a bigger presence and stuff. Well, what if part of your strategy was to really make an impact in some of these vastly, upcoming and growing markets? What if it's to have a stakehold somewhere else? Whatever the intention and purpose is, it's no, I mean, I don't want to bring it into it, but it's like lots of conversations around how we can, use, let's say, generative AI in poor ways. It's really no different than that, because it comes down to really the intention behind it. Exactly. Are you trying to do something just quick and easy, or are you actually putting thought into the process? It doesn't matter what you're using for tools and stuff. It really matters like in the intentionality behind it, as opposed to like, hey, something quick and easy. Oh, that's going to cost you. That's going to, whatever the excuse may be. I think that's really what it comes down to is that level of discipline, which you carried all throughout that whole time.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, and on that point, I can tell you with all confidence, having dealt with hundreds, if not thousands of issues over these 33 years, almost like 99% of the time, the mistakes are made because it's just ignorance. People didn't do enough research, or they just made a mistake. It was not intentional. Nobody was trying to offend somebody. But 99% of the time, the public and the players will absolutely see it as intentional. Because they will ask that question, why did you do this to us? Why are you characterizing us this way? Why are you offending us? And so it's always been that way.
Because when you're in this business, no matter how you look at it, whether you're doing it just for yourself because you're passionate to make games, if you're making games, at least in any capacity, any, let's say, commercial capacity, you are serving people. You are
Yep.
serving others. So you do have a role and a responsibility in that, which, Kate, you did a great job demonstrating.
Yeah, thank you. But I,
Oh,
or
keep going.
sorry.
Keep going.
Well, I was just going to say, I mean, I don't want to be too much of a downer because culturalization often deals this everything we're talking about is what I would call reactive culturalization, where we're looking for ways to avoid those kind of negative reactions. But there is something that I call proactive culturalization where we actually
I was just going to ask that, like, what are some good ways we
okay.
could pressure test these things and kind of make sure that we are proactive in our efforts?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a couple of ways. I mean, being proactive about culturalization basically means, as you've probably guessed by now, is that think about it early. You know, if you write the story you want to write, create the characters you want to create, but at some point, just be mindful of how others might perceive it. If you're actually going to base a certain like group off a real world culture, you say, well, I can't afford to like hire a culturalization expert. That's fine. You know, guess what? You could always go to a university and ask an academic who studies that area or is from that area, because a lot of times I engage academics all the time. I mean, when I worked on Indiana Jones and the Great Circle, I brought in several Egyptologists, a Thai archaeologist, and 2 geologists onto the project to help with it from the academic world. One of the geologists was my own father because he taught geology for decades. So you leverage those resources. And in some cases, especially for indie developers, like you're like, well, I can't afford to pay you, but hey, I'll put your name in the credits as a consultant.
you know,
and for a lot of academics, they'll be like, yeah, that's cool.
I want to say something else too, because we I think we talked a little bit this pre-recording, but and it relates to this too. Like, think about it this way too. When you approach people like, wait a minute, maybe I don't have the funds for this, maybe I don't, whatever the reason or potential excuse, to be blunt is. Look at it from their perspective too. Hey, I'm making a video game and I really want to do this. Well, one, it gives them an opportunity to like share their experience and work in a different way. And honestly, if I was in their shoes and someone said, "Hey, I'm making a video game and I need your help because I'm doing this specifically," like that sounds pretty
Yeah,
exciting and cool. It gives them something different to apply their knowledge, what they care
absolutely.
about, in a different context, meaningful way. That I think, quite frankly, a lot of people in those fields would get pretty excited about, regardless if there's like
Yeah.
pay or not.
Oh, and they're very excited about it. I get constantly approached by people who are historians and other cultural experts saying, "Hey, I want to work for you," or "I want to work on a game because it sounds like a lot of fun," and it is. But the other aspect about being proactive is like not only thinking about it early and at some point during your process taking a step back and kind of considering how might other people see this. And I know that's hard because I mean we get so wedded to our own creation, which is important because you need to be passionate about it, but you also need to disassociate at some point and look at it as objectively as you can. And if you can't, then get friends or colleagues who can come in and try and look at it objectively. But the other aspect about being proactive is that you can actually use culturalization to make your game that is much more tailored for a specific culture. So, for example, when I worked on Temple Run 2, we actually did a special culturalization for just Mexico for the Dia de los Muertos holiday for Day of the Dead, where we reskinned the game to have elements from the Day of the Dead holiday in Temple Run 2. And when that version was released in Mexico, the sales just shot through the roof because people really appreciated that it was tailored specifically to their culture. And we actually did the same approach with that game for the Holi holiday in India for the Festival of Colors. And it also saw a huge spike in sales just because people responded to that nod to their culture, a very specific recognition.
Yeah. Again, it's another cool and creative ways of how people are looking what I would say those examples are how you can serve people in new and different ways. So
Yes.
absolutely love it. Kate, we're coming on time here and everything, but man, has this been such an enlightening conversation. Based on what we talked about today, what are some like key takeaways that you would recommend people listening today?
Well, I think we've covered some already, but I'm going to summarize a little bit. So I think one of the key takeaways is just be aware of these kind of issues, but don't let it interfere with your creative process. It should complement your creative process. I don't want people to be paralyzed by fear, because that's one of the biggest problems I've been seeing from indie to AAA in the entire game space right now over the last couple of years. Because of the social and political polarization, people are getting so afraid about how people are going to react to what they're creating. You, at some point, you just have to accept the fact, like we said, accept the fact that there's going to be people who are going to be haters anyway. So just make the game you want to make, and enjoy the process of making that game, but be aware of the cultural elements in the game, because it's one thing to not care about the haters, but it's another thing you do want to care about offending people because you borrowed something from their culture that you probably should not have borrowed, or you used it in a way that was inappropriate. So that awareness is key. And then the other part of it, just be as proactive as possible when you're doing it during development. Again, it doesn't need to be heavy-handed. It's just something that, write it down saying, hey, have we thought about this? If you have your own internal milestones, maybe at every milestone, you just have a little note, step back and think about it. And the other thing that I would say is that just be prepared. If you're going to address a topic that's potentially controversial, which is totally fine. Games have every right to be controversial and to be as socially activist as film or TV or any other creative medium. But one thing you could do is create what we call a rude Q&A to be prepared for the reactions that you're going to get. This is a concept that comes from PR people. I learned it during my days at Microsoft. So what they do is basically sit down and they anticipate every nasty, ugly question that you're going to be asked about anything in your game. And so it can often be kind of a fun exercise for the team to basically put on your hat as if you're somebody who's going to hate on your game, and think about every little aspect. Why did you make that character that color? Why did you do this? Why did you put that symbol? Why is the story about this? You think about those questions, and then you just write a very brief response to every one of those questions. And the response doesn't have to be a big explanation. It could be like just 1 or 2 sentences. We decided that the creative direction of our game serves the narrative and the story that we wanted to tell. And so we went in this particular direction. Period. Done. You don't need to explain it like a whole dissertation. Just brief explanation. This is why we did this, because it serves our needs or serves the narrative, etc. And you're done.
Yeah, I absolutely love that too, because sometimes I think what happens is we just get in our head, right? And then we think we are required. We have these like our own internal expectations of what others might be thinking of how we need to respond. But I love how you simply put it in those other points, but that in particular, because sometimes we're just our own worst enemies when it comes to these things, and it's us that we should be a little bit more aware of, at least not concerned with, but aware of, not the people who might be actually posing those questions.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason why some of the game teams I work with have called me their Jiminy Crickets. I'm like, I'm their conscience on their shoulders, saying, "I don't think you should do that, Pinocchio."
I love it. I love Jiminy Cricket. He's like, I think, one of my favorite characters.
Yeah, same.
Well, Kate, I again can't thank you enough. This is all really insightful for people who want to learn more about you, connect, want to learn about Jet Setters. Please drop us some links or ways to connect.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got, geography.com is my website, although the site's down right now because I'm redoing it. Setjetters.com, I highly recommend. Check it out. You can download the app. It's on iOS and Android if you want to take a look at that and see what I do in my free time working on that project. And, probably in lieu of my website, just hit me up on LinkedIn. You could add me on LinkedIn. If you have any follow-up questions for any of the points raised, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to answer those questions.
Awesome. Well, folks, check it out. Those links will be available in the show notes. And Kate, thank you again. It was an honor having you on the show.
Thank you.
Hey, everyone. Thank you for listening to another episode of Indie Game Movement. I'm Andrew Pappas, your host, and the show's producer is Mustafa Price. Show notes for this episode can be found by visiting rengenmarketing.com, the number episode of the show. Rengen Marketing is a consulting marketing company that helps indie devs with their marketing efforts. Whether you need guidance with your game's marketing strategy or could use a free marketing plan template, then please visit www.rengenmarketing.com and take action. A special thanks to Dakota Saw for Season 2's opening theme and Melissa Gellis for the new logo design. And as always, thanks for being such great listeners, and we'll see you next time on Indie Game Movement.